Tonight we begin where the medieval world truly excelled, paranoia. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are the most powerful person in the kingdom. Your word is law, your armies are feared, your treasury is vast, and yet every single day you sit down to eat knowing, with cold certainty, that someone in this very room might be trying to murder you with a spoonful of stew. The royal kitchen was never just a kitchen. It was a battlefield where the weapons were invisible, the casualties delayed, and the cooks, whether they knew it or not, were potential assassins. Walk in as king, and the air hits you first, thick with roasting meat, sour wine, wood smoke, and something metallic you pray is just blood from the butcher's block. A haunch of venison turns on the spit, dripping fat into flames that hiss like conspirators. Servants bow low, too low, their eyes fixed on the floorboards because looking directly at majesty can be punished almost as severely as slipping nightshade into the gravy. And there, always there, stands the taster, a man whose official title sounds heroic, guardian of the royal person, but whose real job description is simpler. Eat this and die for me if necessary. He is dressed better than most knights, paid more than most barons, and still his hands tremble as he lifts the silver spoon. Every dish passes across his tongue first. The honeyed wine, the spiced boar, the innocent-looking pear tart dusted with sugar that could hide enough arsenic to fell an elephant. The court watches in silence. 30 heartbeats. 60. If he smiles, the king eats. If his eyes widen, if he clutches his throat, if he simply slumps forward into the soup, well, then the kitchens are purged by fire and sword, and the search for a new taster begins immediately. You might think medieval kings were delusional, jumping at shadows while wearing 2 tons of gold. They were not. Poison was cheaper than steel, quieter than rebellion, and terrifyingly effective. Why raise an army and risk open war when a single drop in the right goblet could rewrite the succession in a single convulsive night? King John of England understood this intimately. The man who lost the crown jewels in a swamp and earned the nickname Soft Sword for his military talents was, paradoxically, extremely talented at poisoning rivals. Chroniclers speak of a rival baron served a special peach at John's table. Hours later, the man was dead, his skin black, his tongue swollen to twice its size. John merely shrugged and blamed bad fruit. In Byzantium, they turned poisoning into performance art. Emperors kept professional poisoners on retainer the way other courts kept jesters. One particularly creative courtier coated the inside of a rival's prayer book with toxin. The man died mid-genuflexion, still clutching the page that killed him. Even the papal palaces weren't safe. Pope Victor III allegedly dropped dead after sipping from a chalice prepared by a cardinal who wanted the tiara a little sooner. The official verdict, God's will. Everyone else whispered, good vintage. So yes, when a medieval king demanded a taster, he wasn't being dramatic. He was being statistical. Every meal was Russian roulette with 6 courses and a side of suspicion. Survival wasn't about courage or divine right. It was about having someone willing to die for your dinner. And in a world where even the holiest wine could hide damnation, paranoia wasn't a personality flaw. It was the only sensible response. The poison didn't stop at kings. It climbed the steps of St. Peter's itself and slipped through the incense like a whispered heresy. In Rome, in Avignon, in the shadowed cloisters where cardinals traded votes the way merchants traded silk, death came quietly in a silver chalice or a single sugared almond passed across a banquet table. One moment a prince of the church was laughing at a bawdy joke in Latin. The next he was clawing at his collar, eyes bulging, while his colleagues crossed themselves and pretended not to notice the purple froth at his lips. The official explanation was always the same: apoplexy, divine punishment, or a sudden excess of zeal. Everyone knew better. Pope John VIII in 882, Alexander Siganas in 1503, countless others in between. The Vatican's own necrology reads like a poisoner's trophy case. The Borgias merely perfected what had been amateur sport for centuries. Cantarella, they called their favorite blend. Arsenic sweetened with sugar and scented with rose water so the victim tasted only summer until the fire started in his veins. A cardinal who blocked the wrong election might wake to find his morning posset already flavored with affection from a rival faction. Another might kiss the papal ring one last time, only to feel the faint grit of powdered diamond on the stone, sharp enough to tear the stomach lining and let slower poisons flood in. Even the holiest rituals were suspect. The Eucharist itself could become a murder weapon. In 1378, during the chaos of the Great Schism, a French cardinal loyal to Avignon celebrated Mass for a house full of Roman partisans. As he raised the chalice, the wine flashed an unnatural green in the candlelight. He drank anyway because to hesitate would be to admit fear in front of enemies. He was dead before the Agnus Dei. The congregation fled screaming that the host had turned to venom in his mouth. The priest who prepared the wine vanished that same night, along with every drop of sacramental liquor in the sacristy. And yet, for all the terror, the truly chilling thing was how ordinary it felt. Servants tested the Pope's food the same way they tested a king's. A young deacon would sip the wine, nibble the wafer, then stand pale and sweating while the Holy Father watched with the weary patience of a man who had buried 3 predecessors in the last decade. One pope, Clement V, reportedly kept a unicorn horn on the dining table, medieval science's most expensive lie, dipped into every cup because legends swore it frothed in the presence of poison. It never once frothed, which either proved the horn genuine or the poisoners exceptionally clever. In the end, the paranoia was not excess. It was survival arithmetic. Every spoonful carried a question: who profits if I choke tonight? Every smiling cupbearer, every bowing cook, every cardinal offering a sweetmeat for your holiness's throat, so dry from preaching, all of them suspects. The higher you climbed, the more lovingly death kissed you on the mouth. So when a medieval ruler pushed away his plate, when a pope refused the loving cup passed by a brother bishop, when an emperor demanded his dog eat from the same dishes as children, understand this: they were not mad. They were simply the only ones still breathing long enough to learn the rules of the game. And the first rule was simple: trust no one, not even the hand that breaks the bread of life. But the greatest medieval conspiracy of all didn't lurk in palaces or papal chambers. It hid in the forests under moonlight, where the trees grew so thick that even the church's torches struggled to reach. Inquisitors rode out with torches and crucifixes, convinced they would find orgies and infant sacrifice. Instead, they stumbled across a circle of terrified peasants holding handfuls of lavender and trying very hard not to cry. The priest beat confessions out of them anyway. Yes, we flew through the air. Yes, we ate babies. Yes, we cursed the priest's cow so it gave sour milk. Whatever you want, just stop hitting us. But sometimes the hunters found things that made even hardened Dominicans go quiet. A ring of stones older than any church in Europe, still warm from a fire that had burned without fuel. Bundles of herbs arranged in patterns no priest could read. Carved wooden faces half buried in moss, smiling like they knew a secret the Gospels had forgotten. The villagers never called it rebellion. They called it insurance. In a world that took everything, your health, your children, your hope, the forest gave something back. A night of singing, the smell of wood smoke and crushed mint, the feeling, however brief, that you were not entirely alone. So the whispers were true. There were secret gatherings under the moonlight. There were rituals the church had outlawed centuries earlier. There were people who refused to let the old world die quietly. They just weren't the monsters everyone expected. They were simply the ones still trying to keep the rest of us alive. For centuries, villagers swore that when the moon was full and the wind carried the scent of damp earth and old fires, small groups slipped away from their hovels. Barefoot, silent, they vanished between the oaks and returned before dawn with leaves in their hair and strange songs still on their lips. The church called them witches, devil worshippers, servants of the Horned One. The villagers called them neighbors, and both were right. Medieval life was a slow crucifixion of the body and spirit. You woke hungry, worked until your back broke, buried half your children before they could walk, and prayed the harvest didn't fail again. The priest told you suffering was holy, that the old gods were dead, that the only path to salvation ran through his collection plate. But when the rye rotted for the third year running and your wife coughed blood into the straw, holiness started to feel like another word for abandonment. So people went back to the woods, not to dance naked around bonfires or kiss goats. That was the church's terrified fantasy. They went to remember, to burn a little sage and rosemary in a stone bowl, to pour milk on the roots of an ancient oak and whisper the names their grandmothers had taught them before Latin smothered everything, to sing the old planting songs that somehow, against every sermon, still made the barley grow taller. These weren't organized cults. They were fragments. A widow who knew which mushrooms eased childbirth pain, a shepherd who could quiet storms by tying 9 knots in a rope while reciting words older than Christ. 3 farmers who met at the standing stones every new moon to bury a loaf of bread and asked the earth politely not to starve them again. They had no leader, no book, no name for themselves. They had only exhaustion and the desperate, stubborn belief that somewhere, something still listened, and the church noticed. In the misty valleys of Friuli in northern Italy, the church finally met something it could neither burn nor fully explain: the Benandanti. These were men, and a few women, who claimed that 4 times a year, during the ember seasons when the veil between worlds thinned, their souls left their sleeping bodies and went out to fight. Not with swords, but with fennel stalks. Not against men, but against witches armed with sorghum canes. They were never an army. They never wanted to overthrow anything. They only wanted the children to live, the pain to ease, the crops to grow, the old songs to stay alive a little longer. In the end, the greatest medieval conspiracy was not one of power or politics. It was the conspiracy of trying, against every sermon and stake, to keep each other breathing. Their battlefield was invisible, stretching across the night sky and the sleeping fields. If the Benandanti won, the crops would thrive. If they lost, famine followed. They told the inquisitors this openly, proudly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They were not ashamed. They were chosen, born with the call over their faces, marked from birth for this nocturnal war. On the appointed nights, they fell into deep sleep, their bodies limp as corpses while their spirits marched out carrying bundles of fragrant fennel. They expected praise, not punishment. After all, they were protecting the harvest, defending Christendom against malefic witches. Surely the church would understand. The church did not understand. The inquisitors leaned forward, quills scratching furiously, trying to twist heroic spirit battles into devilish Sabbaths. Did you ride a goat? No, we walked. Did you renounce Christ? We fought for him. Did you kiss the devil's arse? Sir, we beat witches with herbs. The records read like a comedy of mutual incomprehension until the comedy curdled into horror. The Benandanti were threatened, imprisoned, broken on the rack until some finally confessed to whatever nightmare Rome needed to hear. But before the trials crushed them, their testimony painted something heartbreakingly beautiful. A last, stubborn fragment of an older Europe still alive in the villages. A world where certain people were born with a duty to slip out of their skins and defend the living grain from invisible malice. They were folk saints who never asked for the job. And then there were the women, and the occasional quiet man, who never claimed to leave their bodies at all, yet were feared far more. They were the healers who lived at the edge of the wood, the ones you visited when the priest's prayers failed and the barber surgeon's knife only hastened death. They knew which mushroom stopped bleeding, which willow bark cooled fever, which tiny blue flowers eased the pain of childbirth so completely that mothers wept in gratitude instead of screaming. They delivered babies under moonlight when the village midwife was drunk. They set bones, drew out poison, whispered to colicky infants until the crying stopped. They asked little payment, a chicken, a loaf, sometimes nothing at all, because they remembered their own mothers starving. The church hated them most of all. Competence was suspicious. Mercy without a license was heresy. A woman who could end pain faster than a priest could end a sermon must have stolen that power from Satan. Never mind that Satan had apparently taught her better medicine than the university-trained physicians who killed half their patients. When the healer's cures worked too often, when the priest's Latin failed too loudly, the whispers began. She talks to the moon. Her cat has no tail. She was seen dancing alone. She must be stopped. So the forest that once offered refuge became a trap. The same paths that carried desperate mothers seeking help now carried torch-bearing mobs, convinced they were saving souls. The healers learned to hide their bundles of dried batoni and vervain, to burn their notes, to meet only in twos, to speak in glances instead of words. Yet the knowledge survived, passed hand to careful hand like a candle in wind. Grandmother to granddaughter, midwife to apprentice, a network of quiet rebellion disguised as simple neighborly kindness. While villagers crept to the woods for comfort and healers guarded their herbs in silence, another network operated in plain sight, cloaked in sanctity and Latin plainchant, the monasteries. To the outside world, they were islands of prayer, stone fortresses where bearded men in rough wool copied Virgil by candlelight and sang 7 times a day until their voices cracked. That was the story sold to pilgrims and painted on donor walls. The truth was quieter, colder, and infinitely more useful. And so the whispers were true. The monks knew everything. They had always known, and they wrote it down in perfect Latin long before anyone else realized it mattered. The medieval church was the greatest intelligence agency Europe has ever known. Every monastery sat on a highway of information. Traveling monks, Those harmless brothers seeking hospitality carried sealed letters in their script, letters no secular official dared open for fear of excommunication. They slept in the guest house of a rival kingdom one night, in the abbot's parlor of an allied house the next, and everywhere they went they listened. Confessions heard on the road, gossip traded over thin ale, a careless word from a homesick noble visiting his cousin the abbot. All of it flowed back into ledgers written in neat monastic hands. The Dominicans, the Lord's hounds as they proudly called themselves, took the art to its ruthless peak. Founded to hunt heresy, they became experts at hunting everything else. A friar could arrive in a village asking innocent questions about the new priest's sermons and leave with the names of every smuggler on the river, the location of 3 hidden still rooms, and a detailed report on which baron was sleeping with whose wife. They wrote it all down in cipher, sealed it with black wax, and dispatched it to Lyon or Rome, where clerks collated the harvest. Monastic scriptoria weren't just copying gospels. They were producing situation reports. One surviving letter from a Cluniac prior to his abbot in 1289 reads like a modern intelligence summary. Lord Geoffrey's men drill nightly in the lower meadow. He has purchased 400 arrowheads from the Flemish merchant who lodges with the widow Agnes. The Castellan of Montfort is secretly Lutheran in sympathy and drinks with the Cathar Perfecti on Thursdays. The harvest will be poor. The peasants hoard grain in the old charcoal burners' huts. Recommend immediate tithe adjustment and the transfer of Brother Anselm. He speaks Provençal and can pass for a merchant. Kings knew the value of this network and paid for it. English monarchs kept a permanent royal desk at St. Albans. French kings funded Citeaux. The emperor slipped gold to Fulda. In return, they received early warning of rebellions, troop movements, even which of their own vassals were writing love letters to the wrong queen. A monk on the road cost less than a company of spies and came with the added advantage that no one dared torture a servant of God for information. The Inquisition formalized the whole thing. Sudden visits, midnight interrogations, the careful noting of who flinched when certain names were mentioned. It looked like zeal for souls. It was also the most efficient surveillance system in pre-modern Europe. Reports traveled along the same monastic post roads that carried relics and relics receipts. By the time a heresy reached the public ear, the Curia had known about it for 2 years and already decided whether to suppress, exploit, or tax it. Villagers sensed the net without seeing it. They lowered their voices when a monk passed on the road. They made the sign of the cross when the black-robed Dominicans appeared at market. They told their children, little pitchers have big ears, and some of those ears wear tonsures. They were not wrong. Behind the incense and the chanting, behind the illusion of withdrawal from the world, the monasteries ran a quiet, continent-wide machine of observation, record-keeping, and influence. It was slower than modern intelligence, but far harder to kill. You could murder a spy, you could burn a letter, but you could not burn every monastery from Galway to Kiev. Of all the names that made medieval Europe catch its breath and cross itself, none carried more dark glamour than the Knights Templar. They began with 9 French knights in 1119, poor, pious, sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. Within a century, they were the richest, most feared, and most whispered about order in Christendom. They wore white mantles with a bold red cross, rode into battle singing psalms, and answered to no one except the Pope, and sometimes not even him. Then the rumors started. They guarded a secret treasure greater than all the gold of France. They worshipped a severed head Some said John the Baptist, others said something older and far less holy. They spat on the crucifix during secret initiation rites. They practiced unnatural vices in their chapter houses after midnight. They controlled kings through loans and blackmail. They were, in short, everything a paranoid medieval mind could dream up when confronted with too much power wrapped in too much mystery. And the maddening thing is, half of it was true. The Templars really did invent international banking long before anyone else thought it possible. A knight could deposit silver in Paris, receive a coded letter, and withdraw the same amount in Acre or Cyprus without carrying a single coin through bandit country. Their preceptories were fortresses. Their fleet was enormous, their ledgers written in cipher. Kings borrowed from them, Richard the Lionheart, Louis VII, Philip IV, and kings hated borrowing because debt is the one chain even a crown cannot break. Then there were the closed doors. Every Templar chapter met behind locked doors, admitted no outsiders, and swore oaths so severe that betrayal meant death. What happened inside? The official story was prayer, discipline, and administrative business. The unofficial story grew darker with every retelling. A bearded head on an altar that spoke prophecies, black cats fed on infants' blood, kisses exchanged on the mouth, the navel, and the base of the spine is proof of absolute obedience. Medieval imaginations, starved of facts, gorged themselves on nightmare. King Philip IV of France, eternally broke, eternally furious at anyone richer than himself, decided he had heard enough. On Friday, 13th of October 1307, he struck. In one coordinated dawn raid across the kingdom, thousands of Templars were dragged from their beds, chained, and accused of every horror the Inquisitors could invent. Under torture, they confessed to everything, spitting on the cross, worshiping Baphomet, sodomy, idolatry. The confessions were read aloud in churches while crowds howled approval. Pope Clement V, terrified of Philip and living under French protection at Avignon, dissolved the order and handed its wealth to the crown. And yet, when the smoke cleared and the screams faded, the strangest truth remained. The Templars had indeed guarded secrets, not demons, not severed heads, just the quiet, boring secrets of double-entry bookkeeping, interest-bearing loans, and encrypted correspondence. Secrets so powerful that kings and popes would burn 10,000 men to keep them from spreading. Their real crime was not heresy. It was being too good at money in a world that believed wealth without bloodshed must come from the devil. So yes, the whispers were right. The Templars did hoard treasure. They did hold ceremonies no outsider ever saw. They did bring kings to their knees. Only the treasure was mostly parchment. The ceremonies were disciplinary courts, and the kneeling was done by monarchs who could not balance their own accounts. In the end, the greatest medieval conspiracy turned out to be capitalism in a white mantle with a red cross, and Europe decided that was the most terrifying magic of all. The Black Death arrived like God's own judgment, only slower, uglier, and far more intimate. Whole villages woke to find half their neighbors swollen, black-spotted, coughing blood that smelled of rotting flowers. Children played in streets littered with corpses. The air itself felt poisoned. And while peasants dragged their dead to mass graves and priests fled faster than sinners, a whisper began in the plague pits and spread faster than the disease itself. Someone knew this was coming, and they didn't tell us, because someone did know. Long before the first rat staggered off a Genoese ship in Sicily, letters were moving along church channels, quiet, urgent, written in careful Latin. From the east comes a great mortality. Entire households perish in a day. The Tartars besiege Kaffa with the bodies of their dead. Bishops in Avignon read these reports by candlelight, sealed them again, and sent riders to warn their friends. Monasteries locked their gates weeks before the first bubo appeared in the countryside. Wealthy cardinals slipped away to mountain villas with private wells and private chaplains, taking wagon loads of wine and salted pork. One archbishop in Hungary is recorded ordering his entire household to the castle for contemplation 6 weeks before the nearest village even knew the word plague. Meanwhile, in the villages, the official explanation was imaginative. Flagellants marched bleeding through the streets, claiming the pestilence was punishment for dancing. Priests preached that comet tails had poisoned the air. Doctors in beak masks burned rosemary and shouted at the sky. And still the carts rolled, still the bells tolled, still the living envied the dead. But the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Venetian merchants wrote furious letters when church officials warned them, privately, to avoid certain ports, weeks before the black flags went up. A bishop in Poland closed city gates and forbade travelers from the south before a single case had been reported inside his diocese. A convent in Tuscany suddenly stopped accepting visitors and began stockpiling vinegar and quicklime, months ahead of the first swollen lymph nodes in Florence. The church never admitted foreknowledge. To do so would have been to admit helplessness, and helplessness was bad for donations. Instead, they issued cheerful advice: light bonfires, ring bells, avoid bathhouses, as if anyone could afford one. And above all, repent, because clearly the world had sinned itself into extinction. Yet the whispers grew teeth. Why were so many bishops alive when half of Europe lay rotting? Why did the Pope's palace at Avignon have its own sealed water supply and a private physician who burned letters after reading them? Why were monasteries issuing quarantine orders before the first corpse turned black in the surrounding villages? The answer was brutally simple. The church had the best postal system in Europe, and information was power. They knew the plague was coming the way sailors know a storm by the color of the horizon. They watched it crawl across the map, city by city, and they quietly moved their pieces off the board. They didn't cause the Black Death. They didn't cure it either. But they survived it better than anyone else because they saw it coming and chose very carefully which warnings to shout from the pulpit and which to whisper only to each other. So when the peasants muttered that the clergy had sold their souls for advance notice, when they spat at passing priests and accused them of hiding the truth in locked scriptoria, they weren't entirely wrong. They just didn't understand that in 1347, knowledge wasn't salvation. It was the only privilege left. Some monks took vows of silence. Others took vows of murder. Hidden among the choirs and the herb gardens, behind the endless copying of psalms, a very small number of brothers carried a different kind of discipline: the art of making powerful men die without scandal. They were never many, perhaps one or two per great abbey, and they never wore the black habit openly when they traveled. Instead, they dressed as simple lay brothers, rough wool, calloused hands, faces tanned by honest labor. Perfect camouflage. After all, who suspects the man mending the monastery wall of being able to slip nightshade into a duke's wine without disturbing the vespers bell? They were not fanatics. They were professionals. a noble with a rebellious son, a bishop blocking the wrong appointment, a rival abbot sitting on land the king wanted. Any problem that steel and scandal would only make louder could be solved by a quiet word to the right superior. Gold changed hands in sealed pouches, never recorded in the account books. Then weeks later, a wandering brother arrived at the target's castle asking only for bread and a night by the kitchen fire. He left before dawn. A month after that, the difficult man died peacefully in his sleep. Heart failure, apoplexy, God's mysterious will. The wandering brother was already 2 kingdoms away, hoeing cabbages and singing the office with the innocence of a dove. Chronicles drop only the faintest crumbs. A French count falls from his horse and breaks his neck on a road everyone swears was clear moments earlier. An Italian bishop drowns in his bath despite being alone and an excellent swimmer. An English baron is found dead in his garden, face purple, a half-eaten peach in his stiff fingers, poisoned fruit discovered too late. In each case, a lay brother collecting alms for the poor had been seen nearby days before, then vanished. Monastic records mention brothers disciplined for wandering without leave or failure to observe enclosure, phrases that read, "To those who knew, like quiet reprimands for jobs gone slightly messy." Why did kings and popes tolerate holy assassins in holy houses? Because they worked. A knight's sword leaves widows screaming for vengeance. A monk's poison leaves only a corpse, a funeral mass, and a convenient vacancy. No blood feud, no civil war, no scandalous trial. Just a new name on the charter and the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved with plausible deniability. And if anyone suspected the church, well, accusing God's bride of murder was heresy. Case closed. The killers themselves left almost no trace. No names, no pride, no confession even under torture, because torture assumes the victim fears hell more than he fears his abbot. They lived simply, prayed perfectly, and when age slowed their hands, they retired to some remote cell to copy manuscripts until death came naturally. Their brothers buried them without marker, the way gardeners bury a useful knife that is finally rusted through. So yes, the tavern tales were right. Some monks could recite the entire Psalter from memory, and could also make you recite your final confession before Compline. In an age of loud steel and louder oaths, the quietest killers wore the safest disguise in Europe. And the bells rang on, serene and merciless, over both the victim and the man who sent him to God a little ahead of schedule. Long before the Malleus Maleficarum was printed, long before pointed hats and bonfires became the fashion, the witch hunt was already happening, quiet, local, and heartbreakingly personal. It began in the villages, not the courts. A woman who could stop a nosebleed with a whispered charm. A midwife who brought more babies into the world alive than the priest baptized. An old widow whose yarrow tea cooled a fever when the physician's lancet only hastened death. These were the first witches. They never flew. They never signed pacts in blood. They simply knew too much. And in a world that measured female worth in silence and obedience, knowledge itself was the original sin. The accusations were always the same. When the cow's milk dried up, she looked at it wrong. When the baby cried all night, she passed the cradle at dusk. When the storm flattened the barley, she was seen gathering dew under the full moon, probably to water her infernal herbs. Proof was whatever the village needed it to be: a knotted cord found under the doorstep, a black cat that came when she whistled, a birthmark shaped with enough imagination like a devil's teat. They tried them in barns and churchyards, not grand tribunals. Dunk them in the horse pond with thumbs tied to toes. Sink and be innocent. Float and burn. Weighed them against the big church Bible. Heavier than scripture meant guilty. Made them recite the Lord's Prayer. One stumble, one forgotten amen, and the rope was ready. And yet the cruel irony was carved into every grave. The only real witches medieval Europe ever caught were the ones desperately trying to keep it alive. The woman who could set a broken leg so cleanly the man walked again. The one who knew which mushrooms eased the pain of childbirth so mothers didn't tear apart screaming. The one who brewed willow bark tea long before any doctor admitted it worked better than bleeding. Their crime was competence. Their magic was memory. Recipes passed from mother to daughter since the days when the church was still a persecuted sect hiding in catacombs. They formed no coven, no grand conspiracy, only a thin, fragile chain of women teaching women in whispers. This for fever, this for bleeding, this for the child who will not turn in the womb. Never write it down. Never speak it where a man can hear. Meet only in twos, at the well in the wash house behind the hedge while gathering nettles. If they come for one of us, scatter. Burn the garden, forget my name. They were hunted for centuries before anyone bothered to write a manual. The church eventually caught up, gave the terror Latin titles and papal bulls, turned village panic into continental industry. But the first stakes were lit by neighbors who once begged those same women for help when their own children burned with fever. In the end, the greatest witches were never the ones dancing naked under the moon. They were the ones who refused to let the dark win. One poultice, one murmured lullaby, one secret handful of herbs at a time. And Europe thanked them by tying them to stakes and calling it purification. Some kings refused to stay dead, not because they were immortal, but because medieval Europe desperately wanted them to be. When a ruler fell, battle, poison, a suspiciously well-timed fall from a tower, the chronicles recorded the funeral, the tears, the succession. And then weeks or decades later, a hooded stranger would appear at a remote monastery, or a fisherman would swear the dead emperor asked for directions, or a peasant child would point at a bearded pilgrim and whisper, "That's him." The most intoxicating case belongs to Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, dead in 1250, buried with full pomp in Palermo Cathedral, mourned by half of Christendom and quietly celebrated by the other half. Frederick had been too brilliant, too strange, too dangerous. He spoke Arabic fluently, kept a harem and a private zoo, wrote a book on falconry that reads like poetry, and terrified popes by treating the church like just another bureaucracy. Europe exhaled when he died. Then the sightings began. A gray-bearded traveler paying with old Sicilian tari coins, bearing Frederick's face. A hooded figure seen praying at the emperor's empty tomb. Posture perfect, voice murmuring in flawless Swabian German. Merchants swearing they shared wine with a man who laughed exactly like the dead emperor and asked pointed questions about the new regime. Within a generation, full-blown cults had formed. The Frederikists believed he slept beneath a mountain, Etna or the Kyffhäuser, depending on who was telling it, waiting with his knights until Germany or Italy needed him again. Every few decades, a new Frederick appeared, scarred, weary, always with the same piercing eyes and the same story. I never died. I only rested. Centuries later, in 1480s England, another ghost walked, Richard of Eastwell. A quiet, cultured bricklayer working on a Kent estate who read Latin better than the parish priest refused to speak of his childhood, and once, when very drunk, admitted to the local parson that he was the illegitimate son of Richard III, hidden away after Bosworth Field. When he died in 1550, they buried him in the churchyard with unusual care and no name on the stone. The parish register simply says, R. Plantagenet, December 22, Tyranny. Medieval record-keeping was so poor and politics so lethal that faking death was often the sanest choice. A deposed king could shave his beard, take minor orders, and vanish into a monastery under a new name. A prince marked for murder could switch places with a loyal double, slip away in a pilgrim's cloak, and let the world believe the blood on the floor was his. The absence of portraits, fingerprints, or DNA meant that identity was mostly a matter of confidence and the right accent. So when villagers swore the old king still walked among them, when tavern songs promised his return on a white horse, they weren't always deluded. Sometimes they were remembering a very clever man who decided that the only way to survive the Middle Ages was to die on schedule and live afterwards in peace. And who could blame him? In an age of poisoned cups, papal curses, and brothers who smiled while sharpening daggers, the greatest luxury a king could buy wasn't gold or land. It was a quiet grave no one ever needed to open. Water was never innocent. It could drown you, freeze you, carry plague on its back, or simply disappear when you needed it most. In a world where every stream was also a sewer and every well sat 10 paces from the pigsty, the simplest drink could become a death sentence. So when people began dying in waves, throats closing, bellies swelling, skin turning the color of old iron, the explanation was obvious. Someone had poisoned the wells. It was the perfect crime, invisible, untraceable, and impossible to disprove. A handful of powder at midnight, a whispered prayer to whatever dark thing listened, and by morning an entire village would be vomiting itself inside out. The accusation needed no evidence. The corpses were evidence enough. During sieges, it was official policy. Armies on both sides of every war dumped rotting carcasses, dung, and quicklime into the enemy's water supply. Military manuals calmly recommended corrupting the springs the way modern ones recommend cutting power lines. A dead horse floating in the castle cistern could end a siege faster than any battering ram. But sieges were rare. Random dying in peaceful valleys was common, and that's where the terror lived. A bad summer, rain that tasted strange, a week of stomach cramps and black stools, and the village would turn on itself. The stranger who arrived last month. The old woman who always filled her bucket after dark. The Jews who drew water before dawn so no one sees what they add. In 1349, while the Black Death raged, entire Jewish communities were burned alive for the crime of surviving longer than their Christian neighbors. Proof, the mob screamed, that they had the antidote and were keeping it for themselves. Yet the darkest truth was simpler and more cruel. Most wells really were poisoned, just not by human hands. Heavy rain washed manure into shallow dug pits. Dead rats floated just beneath the surface, too waterlogged to see. Copper and lead leached from old buckets. Algae bloomed green and lethal after hot weeks. Medieval people drank death every day and called it Tuesday. They invented conspiracies because the real explanation, that the world itself was trying to kill them, slowly, carelessly, and without malice, was too unbearable to live with. So they dragged the poisoner to the square, forced a confession with hot irons, and threw another body on the pyre, certain that this time they had solved the mystery. The well kept killing, and the water never confessed. In a world without portraits, dental records, or even consistent spelling of names, identity was less a fact than a performance. A man with the right scars, the right accent, and enough confidence could walk into a tavern and announce, "I am the king you thought dead at Kosovo," and half the room would believe him because hope is stronger than evidence. The other half would sharpen pitchforks just in case. Medieval Europe was crawling with resurrected royalty. The most famous impostor, who might not have been an impostor at all, is the quiet bricklayer of Eastwell we already met. But he was only one petal on a very strange flower. In 1360, a tilemaker in Cologne proclaimed himself Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, returned from the Kyffhäuser cave where he had slept for 2 centuries. Crowds followed him for weeks until the real emperor's men hanged him. In Portugal, entire villages swore loyalty to King Sebastian, who had vanished in battle in 1578 and whose body was never positively identified. 4 different Sebastians appeared over the next decades, each with better stories than the last. In Russia, at least 6 false Dimitris claimed to be Ivan the Terrible's miraculously surviving son, and one of them actually sat on the throne for 11 months. The recipe was always the same. A ruler dies violently or disappears. The body is conveniently mutilated, lost at sea, or buried in haste. Years later, a man appears who knows court etiquette, speaks the dead king's childhood dialect, and bears a scar in exactly the right place. Civil war or succession crisis conveniently rages, so people want to believe. Poor record keeping made it easy. Births were noted on loose parchment that burned in the next castle fire. Nobles routinely sent infants to be fostered in distant households, swapped 2 babies, and no one could prove anything. Kings themselves played the game. Edward II may have escaped his murder in Berkeley Castle and lived quietly as a hermit in Italy. Richard II almost certainly did not die in Pontefract. A man claiming to be him led a rebellion in Scotland years later, and Henry IV was nervous enough to keep the official corpse on public display for weeks. Sometimes the impostor was pure fraud. Sometimes he was a half-brother, a bastard, or a loyal double who decided the story was better than the truth. Sometimes, just sometimes, he was exactly who he claimed to be, because the simplest way to survive a death sentence is to die convincingly and start a new life 3 kingdoms away. The chronicles treat these men as jokes or tragedies, but read between the lines and you see a continent that half understood the trick. Every tavern song about the king beneath the mountain, every whispered sighting of a hooded figure paying with old coins, was medieval Europe's way of saying, "We know the powerful sometimes vanish on purpose. We know graves can be empty. We know that in this world of poison and politics, the smartest king is the one who learns how to disappear." So when a mysterious stranger rode into town, scarred, silent, and carrying a sword older than anyone alive, the question was never, "Is he real?" The question was, which one of us needs him to be real badly enough to crown him? Deep inside certain monasteries, behind iron-bound doors and 3 separate locks, there existed rooms no pilgrimage guide ever mentioned. The monks called them the Armaria Secreta, the hidden shelves. Everyone else called them the forbidden library. To enter, you needed the abbot's key, the librarian's permission, and a conscience strong enough to lie to God when he eventually asked what you had been reading. Inside, the air was colder, drier, and smelled of old secrets rather than incense. Shelves rose to the ceiling, packed with volumes chained like dangerous animals. Some were beautiful, ivory covers, gold lettering, illuminations that hurt to look at directly. Others were plain, rough, deliberately ugly, as if shame could be bound in calfskin. Here lay everything the church had decided the world was not ready to know. Arabic astronomy that placed the earth in motion long before Copernicus was born. Medical texts describing the circulation of blood with diagrams so accurate that owning one could get you accused of dissecting angels. Gospels the early church had quietly voted out of the Bible. Thomas laughing at the resurrection, Mary Magdalene preaching to the apostles, Jesus as a child turning clay birds into real ones, and then striking a playmate blind for breaking them. Pagan spell books copied for study by monks who underlined the useful parts. Alchemical treatises promising gold, immortality, or both. Even, rumor insisted, a single volume bound in strange leather that screamed when opened, though no one who claimed to have heard it ever spoke again. The church did not burn these books. Burning was loud, public, and left martyrs. Instead, they cataloged them, annotated them, and locked them away for the protection of simple souls. Every few decades, a new pope or inquisitor would order an inventory, and the list always grew longer. Knowledge once seized rarely stayed buried. Some abbots argued the book should be preserved for the learned few. Others insisted they be walled up forever. The compromise was the locked room, and the monk who guarded it, usually elderly, half-blind, and absolutely certain that curiosity had personally killed every cat he ever loved. Yet the forbidden shelves leaked. A young novice copying an approved text would glimpse the next volume on the bench, a treatise proving the sphericity of the earth with mathematics so elegant it felt like blasphemy. A visiting bishop needing a rare commentary on Revelation would accidentally be handed the wrong manuscript and read 3 pages that kept him awake for weeks. Traveling scholars bribed the porter with Rhenish wine and left with notes tucked inside their psalms. The villages sensed the vaults even when they never saw them. They told stories of monks who could predict eclipses, cure the pox with forbidden words, or read the future in star charts drawn by Saracen devils. They were not entirely wrong. Behind those locked doors lay the slow, secret heartbeat of the Renaissance. Every idea the Middle Ages tried to smother, quietly breathing, waiting for the day the key turned in the hand of someone brave or foolish enough to let it out. So yes, the whispers were true. Somewhere in Europe, in candlelit silence, the church kept a library of everything it had forbidden the rest of us to think. And every century, one more book escaped. There was one last conspiracy that never needed parchment, seals, or midnight meetings. It was older than the church, older than castles, older than the Latin tongue itself. It lived in the fields, in the rhythm of the plow, in the hush that fell when the moon was dark and the dogs refused to bark. They called it the Wild Hunt. Every winter when the wind screamed down from the north like a dying god, people swore they heard it, the baying of impossible hounds, the thunder of hooves on frozen cloud, the long, cold blast of a horn that made the marrow ache. Then the sky would split open and the riders would come. Not men, not anymore. A king with antlers of ice or a single burning eye, sometimes a queen pale as birch, sometimes a faceless host wearing the armor of every army that ever lost a battle. Behind them poured the restless dead, unbaptized children, executed criminals, women who died in childbirth, soldiers who fell far from home, all of them whipped on by black dogs with eyes like glowing coals and a hunger that never ended. If you heard the hunt, you were supposed to fall flat on your face and pray whatever prayers you still remembered. If you looked up, one of the riders would see you, and then you rode with them forever. Farmers left bowls of milk on the doorstep during Yuletide for the good folk, though everyone knew the good folk had been hunted out centuries earlier. The milk was for the hunt, so it would pass over the house and take someone else. The church tried everything. They called it superstition, demon work, the delusions of drunken peasants. They sent priests with holy water and bells to stand at crossroads on the dangerous nights. Most of those priests came back pale and silent. A few never came back at all, because the hunt was never fully pagan, never fully Christian. It was the land itself remembering every violent death it had ever drunk. Every battlefield, every gallows hill, every woman drowned as a witch, every child left on the hillside for exposure. Their shades were gathered up each winter and ridden across the sky like a reminder written in storm clouds. You could give the leader any name you wanted: Woden, Herne, Cain, Satan, the devil on his black horse, and you would be both right and wrong. He had warned them all, and none. He was simply the debt coming due. In some villages, they still set an extra place at the table on the longest night, a dark loaf and a cup of ale left untouched. In others, they barred the doors, stopped every crack with wool, and forbade anyone to speak above a whisper until dawn. Children were warned never to follow a strange light in the fields, never to answer a voice that called their name 3 times in the dark, and every year somewhere, a rider was one soul short, and the horn sounded again. The wild hunt never recruited with letters or promises. It took what it was owed, and Europe, guilty century after guilty century, always paid. And so we come to the end of the whispering, all of it, the poisoned chalices, the hidden libraries, the monks who killed with rosemary and prayer, the kings who died twice, the women who healed with forbidden leaves, the riders thundering across the winter sky, was true, not in the tidy way chronicles like to pretend, with dates and charters and neat moral lessons. It was true the way a nightmare is true, jagged, half-remembered, soaked in blood and candle smoke, and the smell of wet earth after rain. The Middle Ages were never a dark pause between brighter ages. They were a long, fevered conversation between people who loved life so fiercely that they lied, killed, prayed, and pretended death itself could be negotiated with just to keep breathing one more season. Every conspiracy we have followed was, at its root, the same conspiracy. The conspiracy to stay alive, to keep the child from dying of fever, to keep the harvest from failing, to keep the king, or the idea of the king, alive when steel and poison circled like wolves, to keep the old songs alive when new priests forbade them, to keep one page of forbidden knowledge from burning so that someone, someday, might read it and think a new thought. They did terrible things for it. They did beautiful things for it. Mostly they did quiet, stubborn, desperate things that no chronicle ever bothered to record. A midwife rinsing her hands in vinegar before touching a newborn, a monk copying a banned treatise by moonlight, a mother singing a lullaby in a language the priest had outlawed, A king slipping out the postern gate in a pilgrim's cloak because the only crown he wanted now was anonymity. That was the greatest secret the Middle Ages ever kept. Not the treasure beneath the temple, not the head that spoke in the dark, not the name of the poison that left no trace. The greatest secret was that under the iron and the incense and the screaming, ordinary people were conspiring every single day to remain human. And somehow, against every stake and sword and plague cart, they succeeded. We are the proof. We are what they managed to smuggle past the flames,